to Speak the podcast with my glorious guest today, Andrew Thorp. And Andrew is a speaker and trainer in the applied storytelling arena. So it's around communication. You've called yourself the verbal PR, Andrew, and also, and I'm going to get you to explain this, the multi-story man. So explain a little bit about what that means to you and what that should mean to us.
Okay, well, thank you, Jackie. It's great to be on the show. Yes, I call it applied storytelling because it's storytelling not necessarily for entertainment purposes or for putting children off to sleep at night. It's storytelling where somebody in the business world has to get their message across, has to connect with their audience, has to be persuasive, has to be understood, and hopefully liked as well, because this is the key to being persuasive. So it's in a way, it's in the field of sales training. It's a very soft form of sales training in a way, soft persuasion. And I also describe myself sometimes as the multi-story man because I seem to have a library of them. And people are always telling me, how on earth do you remember all of these things? And, my kids will tell me I forget all sorts of things at my advanced years, but I seem to have this recall of little episodes in life, either things that I've experienced or I've seen in others. And then I'm able to weave those into, conversations such as this, or and then indeed to help other people do that, to accumulate a library of material that they can use in things like a job interview or a pitch, or to come across better on a podcast interview. So that's kind of where it comes from.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously, I'm in a similar arena, so I kind of understand what that is. But for those of people that are listening that don't understand the use of stories, apart from maybe sitting around a dinner table and recounting something that's happened, what is the benefit of storing up a library of stories?
Well, I think let's define what I mean by storytelling. First of all, it's storytelling for most people is telling an anecdote. That's what they associate it with, over dinner or perhaps a bedtime story. And that's a very narrow interpretation of the word. I mean, from the acting world that storytelling can apply to, say, a whole movie or a play. It's a great piece of storytelling. So that doesn't mean it's an anecdote. It means the way the thing flows and has sort of a journey that the audience is taken on. So I think of it more in terms of framing a message. It's very much about message framing. How do you put a pitch or an idea across so that the audience gets it, understands it, warms to it, and then warms to you at the same time? So it's advantageous in those situations where you have to be persuasive, where you have to educate the audience so that they understand what you're trying to say. But it's also useful in a more anecdotal sense where you're maybe trying to find common ground with people. And we've all come across this thing where someone tells us something that's happened to them. And then our inclination is to say, well, yeah, the same thing happened to me the other week. And then hopefully you find common ground, although that has to be done sensitively because there is that thing called conversational theft, where suddenly it's about you whereas it started being about them. So it's applied really in a mixture of either staged situations, so you're given a platform to pitch, or in more conversational situations. I could sometimes call those an SSS, a spontaneous speaking situation, where you're having to draw upon maybe that library of experiences to, for example, find common ground with people.
Yeah, people quite often, especially in say networking or going into a room cold, where they're faced with people that they kind of know that they have to communicate with in order to further themselves, further their business, put themselves show themselves in a good light. And people freeze. They kind of have this fear of sharing. So how would you think that using stories can get people over that fear of walking into a room full of strangers?
Well, I'll use an example based on that very scenario that you described, walking to a room full of strangers at, say, a networking event. And I remember seeing a picture from a client of mine, actually, who hosted an event at a cinema complex in Manchester. It's called Home, Home. and it's one of the newer cinema complexes, and they run networking events because they hold events in the theaters, but also in the, you know, the sort of like a big breakout bar area. And it struck me that there was a scenario I could envisage where someone, you know, is approached maybe by somebody else, and rather than saying something like, well, what do? You could say, well, you know, the last time I was here, I was on a date. And then they may say, well, how did it go? And then you might say, well, we're married now, so quite well, actually. Or not very well, because I went to a horror film and that wasn't her thing, and that we never spoke after that. So it's just a way of hooking on to something in the environment, which is, you know, something in your back catalogue of experiences that maybe gets that interaction going, rather than that very cold, you know, or what do you do, which puts people under pressure generally.
Yeah. So what is the answer then to that question? Because it's something I am terrible at, and you know, even, you know, with my own acting background, as you say, and knowing exactly what it is that we're talking about here, there is still that kind of that feeling that you need an elevator pitch. And can you then, in that elevator pitch of you know, the answer to the question, what do you do for a living? Can you weave a story into that? How do you use the elevator pitch and a story to kind of help in that situation?
Well, you can, because and again, I'll use a story to illustrate this. I met somebody at a networking event about 3 or 4 years ago, and I actually asked her that question, you know, about what she did, and she said, well, I provide zero accounting advice. And I said, well, that doesn't sound very generous. And she didn't mean that. She meant Xero, the accounting software package, which is with an X. And she didn't really know what I meant at first when I said that doesn't sound very generous. And then she realized it, you know, the light bulb went on. Oh, I see what you mean. Oh, that didn't sound right, did it? And it broke the ice, and then we got on quite well. But she's actually used that story a number of times when she's asked to introduce herself. So she will start by saying, well, somebody asked me that question about 3 years ago, and I said this. So she's actually using an anecdote as a way of getting into what it is she actually does.
Yeah, perfect. Well, yeah, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. So tell us a little bit about how you got to this point, and where did your speaking training, storytelling, you know, where did it all start for you?
Well, I mean, obviously through the golf industry, Jackie.
Oh, well, of course, the golf industry.
How else would it happen? So yes,
it was golf.
I didn't make that up. I mean, I spent 22 years working in the golf and leisure industry in the UK because my brother's a pro golfer. He's 10 years my senior, and I worked for a long time in the industry as a referee for the Professional Golf Association, as a journalist, as a coach of golfers. And so for years and years and years, that was my field. And then I decided that I was going to change direction. I won't go into the details of why, but it was a bit of a life-changing experience that led me to consider a change. So I thought, well, what did I like doing in the golf industry that I'd like to do more of now? And the answer was public speaking, because I've always loved you know, speaking with an audience and working with an audience. So I sort of set out to do that initially. And then realized that it was very difficult at the beginning to make a living doing that. So you find another way, and for me that was to help people with their presenting skills. And then it struck me in that work that what they were saying when they were presenting wasn't as interesting as it could be. In other words, they weren't doing justice to their message. They didn't have a story to tell. So that's really how it came about, through a process of reinvention and moving out of one industry to another, but finding that crossover between the two. Yeah,
I know. So you wanted to kind of become a speaker. Is that so? You wanted to get on stage and share your story?
Yes, I'm a frustrated actor, Jackie. I'm so jealous of you having done that for so many years. So I kind of had to find a way of showing off in front of an audience and getting paid for it. And I couldn't do that as an actor because no one will probably hire me to do that. So I found another niche which enabled me to work with an audience. And I have to say, I mean, I still enjoy doing that, but I actually get more of a buzz now of seeing other people that I've been coaching, come to life a little bit and find their voice and their confidence, which again, I think it is crossing over into your world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, from what I've learnt and from the people I've spoken to and from what I've been doing over the years is that quite often frustrated actors do kind of find their way into some form of education.
Yeah.
Because it is an excuse to stand up in front of an audience and, share your ideas, but it's also what you get back, what you get back from that audience. And I think that for me certainly is what I love about what I do.
I think the audience is always educating you.
Yes.
And I think that's been one of the trickier things of the pandemic period of dealing with an on-screen audience rather than a live one, because that feedback is limited. And we rely so much on working with the vibe and the energy in the room. It's a very different experience when you're trying to connect with pixels on a screen.
Yeah. So how have you found that? I mean, how was lockdown for you in terms of speaking work?
It sort of fell off a cliff for a while. There was very little that happened for a while after March last year when Boris made his announcement. But it's gradually come back. So all of the gigs that I was doing face to face have more or less been replaced with online versions. And obviously it's very simple by comparison with not having to travel places. But it's also limiting in the way that I've just mentioned. So it's from a financial point of view, it's worked out okay. There has been a transfer of business from one medium to another, but I do miss the face-to-face stuff. I'm actually doing my first face-to-face speech in Durham in the northeast of England on next week.
Wow.
So I hope I can still do it.
Yeah.
It's been a long time.
So how do you prepare then for the speaking roles that you do? What's your kind of routine in the lead up to actually doing a talk? Maybe right from putting a talk together. How do you start? Where do you start?
Well, it always starts with the organizer telling you what they're looking for and who the audience is. And they're not always terribly good at doing that. You have to tease that out of them. In some cases, they don't really know who the audience is going to be because it's a public event and they have a sense of who they might be, but it's partly guesswork on their part. So I think you're trying to find an angle that they're attracted by, and they're often attracted by the word storytelling. But again, you've got to drill down and explore, well, what is it you actually want within that genre? Is it to entertain? Is it to educate? Is it to connect? Is it to help people sell and persuade? So then I've got my sort of standard material, all my theories and models and, examples and case studies and so forth and stories that are in the bag. And then you've just got to use the right ones for that particular client and that situation that you think will work and develop a sort of a sequence and a flow for that. But then again, you've got the variable of how engaged will the audience be? Will it be a smaller audience and be a little bit more workshoppy and back and forth, in which case there's less presentable material that you'll have time to give because they're eating time with those conversations, which is very valuable. So in a way, I've got to be flexible a little bit about, having some material that I'm planning to use that might be, dropped or cast over, because the valuable bit to my mind is when you get a two-way with the audience.
Yeah. So tell me how the TED Talk came about for you, because you've done a couple, haven't you, of the TED?
I've done 3. I did one in 2010, which was at Warwick University, which was an interesting experience. I'll expand on that in a second. I think there was one in 2015 and then another one in 2018. That was in Cheshire. The middle one was in Manchester. But the first one was most memorable, I think, because it was at Warwick University. It was a student organised event. I'd actually done some volunteer mentoring and coaching for a lady who turned out to then run the TEDx event in Warwick. So she said, well, would you consider doing a talk for us at the university that she was organising? So that's how it happened. But when I look back at it, Jackie, I don't really like watching that talk because I was pretty early on in my speaking career. I didn't think it was terribly good in hindsight, and I hadn't really figured out my message. It was a little bit sort of stitched together and not quite a coherent narrative as I look back at it now. I also paced up and down like a nervous tiger. And I look at it and I think, oh, for God's sake, just stand still, will you? I'm moving up into the cameras, having to move back and forth all the time. And I also remember that a very famous person actually was on after me. It's Sir Robin Penrose. I think it's Robin Penrose, who worked with Stephen Hawking. He's one of the world's leading theoretical or mathematical physicists. And he's actually in the film of Stephen Hawking that Eddie Redmayne starred in. And I mean, the character is in the film. And he had 2 overhead projectors when he did his talk. Can you imagine that, Jackie? OHPs with hand-drawn acetates.
Wow.
So he was able to use this wonderful phrase, because he was talking about the Higgs boson particle, the start of the universe, all those sorts of things. And he used this wonderful phrase. He said, I'll just move the universe over here for a minute, as he's transferring acetate from one OHP to another. And the other thing I remember is that his microphone, his lapel mic, was rubbing against his jacket, his lapel. And there was this horrible noise in the audience. And because the students were rather in awe of the great man himself, nobody had the nerve to tell him and stop him mid-flow that his microphone was making this awful noise, until it got so bad that they had to do it. They had no choice but to stop him. So I look back with fondness at that, because it was the first of 3, but it's I think that the 3 have got better.
Yeah.
But I guess the viewers will be the judge of that if they see them.
So did you have any training yourself? Did you have any, not necessarily acting training, but speaking and how you need to breathe, move, don't move, anything like that?
No, not formally, but I'm one of these people who learns, I guess, by osmosis, just by trying things and doing things, but also through emulation. And when I learned to play golf as a youngster, and I think this will be commonplace amongst lots of sporting people, they will find somebody they admire and they almost copy their swing or try and be that person. And it might be the same in acting. You know, I want to be like that person or that person. So you tend to pick up little traits and habits and routines that they do and incorporate them into your style. So I did that with speaking. So I used to watch loads of TED Talks when I was introduced to them and thought, well, I'd love to speak like Sir Ken Robinson, or be a great storyteller like he is, or Brené Brown. So these were very influential people in my speaking career. But then, of course, you've got to find your own voice. You've got to find your own style and your own material. But it's certainly been influenced by people like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice, actually. You know, lots of times when I'm working with people on building their confidence around speaking, is I will say to them, who is it that you admire? Then, you know, go and watch what they do, go and see how they do it, or walk around the room and feel like you are them. You know, just take on that status, take on what that is. So I think that's really good advice. But exactly as you say, you then need to find your own voice. You need to find, you know, your own authenticity and your own story to tell.
Yes.
But yeah, no, it's great to sort of emulate. And Ken Robinson is my absolute hero. I mean, I watched that Do Schools Kill Creativity talk that he did and laughed. And I never expect, you know, you don't expect to end up with tears rolling down your face watching a TED talk. But yeah, his storytelling and the way that he tells stories. I sent that to so many people. I shared that link with everybody I knew because I just thought the message was amazing anyway. But just the way he did that was also incredible.
And a great, I mean, like you, I admire him, and I admired. It's very sad that he's no longer with us, but he was such a hero of mine, and I loved his use of light and shade. You know, the way that he weaves in a very serious, profound message through humor.
Yeah, and through those anecdotes, through those stories.
My favorite one in that one is when he's talking about the little girl in the art class in the classroom. And the teacher walks up and says, what are you drawing? And the girl said, well, I'm drawing a picture of God, miss. And she said, well, it's interesting. We don't really know what God looks like, do we? And she said, well, you will in a minute.
Yeah.
Which I thought was a wonderful
Yeah.
line. But then
Yeah.
he goes on to make a point, doesn't he? He said, and
Yeah.
of course, children will take a chance. They're not afraid of failure. And, the education system sort of vilifies mistakes. It stigmatizes errors because, you're looking for all correct answers.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of value in his point that, the education system doesn't encourage creativity and risk taking in a way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I did, the podcast that I did before my Power to Speak, one in my Atticus Arts not incantation. I can't remember what the word is. Incarnation. Incarnation was really all about creativity. And I love talking about creativity in business because people assume that if to be creative, you need to be able to paint or draw or play a musical instrument. But no, creativity is about problem solving, about risk taking, about all of those things. It's about using our brains.
Well, it is. And I also saw a wonderful quote a while ago. I can't remember who it's attributed to, but it was something along the lines of, before you can learn how to paint, you've got to learn how to see.
Absolutely.
Which I thought was wonderful.
Yeah.
It isn't just about techniques to do something. You've got to sort of feel it and connect with it on an emotional or almost like a spiritual level before you can then start to produce something.
Yeah. I used to curate art exhibitions for our local art centre when I worked there. And I had a young girl came in and she was only about 17, 18. She came in with her mum and they brought in some abstract stuff that she'd been doing. And, her mum was so proud of her. And yes, the pictures were very pretty, but there was no life behind them. There was no intention behind them, no motivation behind them. And I just had to say to her, they're lovely, but there's no feeling in there. There's no, you need to go away, even just for a year, and live some life and look around you and observe and absorb that, and then paint from there. So it is absolutely that. But it's people mistake creativity for something very narrow, when actually it's something that's within all of us.
But again, this comes back to this point about, is it surface based or is it deeper on the inside? And a classic situation with interpersonal skills would be listening skills. When someone's been on a listening skills course and they'll say to me, well, Andrew, I nodded a few times and I went and I raised an eyebrow, I went, oh, that's interesting, at least 3 times. Does that mean I'm a good listener? And you say, well, that's not kind of where we're coming from with this. Were you really interested in them? What was your intent in that situation? Was your intent to try and really understand them deep down, or were you just simply going through the checklist of doing this and this?
Yeah, and that brings me to a point that I was going to bring up with you, with something that I heard you say, and I think it must have been whether it was in the TED Talk or one of the other videos I watched, was about, in order to be interesting, you need to be interested. And I think that's a very important point, is that if you can give other people the time to actually listen to what it is that they're saying, then you will become interesting, because you are taking that time. And people like to feel validated by the fact that somebody else is listening to them.
They do. It feeds their ego. It makes them feel better about themselves. They feel of more value. And you're getting a lot of useful intel from them as well. It's the basis of consultative selling, in a way, is to do more questioning and listening rather than speaking and opining. And I love this phrase, do you listen with the intent to understand, or do you listen with the intent to reply? And I think a lot of people are just waiting to say something that they've already formed in their head as a nugget of wisdom. And I'm not saying that I'm immune to that. I think we all do that, because our minds are racing ahead compared to what's coming in.
Yeah. I do an exercise in my drama classes, that I love to do with adults and children. Doesn't matter who you do it with, but you get two people to kind of walk around a room arm in arm and pretend that they are one person, and they get to tell a story as they walk around. Nobody else is listening. I do this in a group, so they're all doing it at the same time. So they're really intent on what it is that they are doing in their pair, but they only get one word each. So they're walking through a jungle and describe what you see before you, but you've literally got one word each. So I am walking through a jungle. I can. And it's incredible how hard people find that.
Yes.
Because they are jumping ahead.
Yes.
Because they want to put words in the other person's mouth.
That's right.
And it just takes so much discipline and so much focus to just go with it. Just tell that story. See that, because obviously people are seeing different things in their own imaginations.
Yes.
But to not jump ahead, to not block yourself by trying to be funny or witty or interesting, is just listen and reply. Just take that time. And that's something that really comes from my acting background that I now use with businesses. And I think it's, that we were talking before the recording started about head versus heart.
Yes.
And how you were working with in corporate environments with people and leaders that kind of think from the head rather than the heart. Explain a little bit more about that.
Well, an example would be if you wanted to boost levels of employee engagement to make them feel more connected and loyal to the company. You might send them a gift at Easter or Christmas time and think, the job is done. But then it might not work because there's no personalization of the gift. So I think if you can think about what's important to that person, that you remember something they told you, 3 or 4 years ago about an ambition that they had, or a bottle of wine they'd always wanted to try, or a show they've always wanted to go to, or a place to visit, and you arrange it for them. My goodness me, the impact that has will vastly outweigh anything that you've done with that blanket gesture. But you've got to get to understand people. You've got to want to know them more deeply than just simply on a surface level of what they're doing, technically within the business.
So do you find then that that business owners and leaders are so? I just wonder, because obviously these are the people that I also work with, and it's sometimes difficult to explain that what we do is not just a soft skill. It's an essential skill. But I do wonder whether these leaders kind of look on it as frivolous, not really needed. We don't have time to pander to our employees in that way. Have you come across that?
Well, very often, yes, and I'm sure you and I cross over in that regard. And isn't soft skills a horrible term? The implication being that it's soft and squidgy and maybe less important, less tangible than good old hard technical skills with a certificate at the end of it. But I find that a lot of my clients come from a technical background. They've grown up in a profession. They've had to learn a lot of technical knowledge. That's their grounding professionally. And then they move into managing a team, and then they move into running a company and being a leader. And some of them make that transition very effectively from being just a technician to being an understander and a motivator of people. But many of them don't make that transition. They're still stuck in the ways of logic and, well, if I do this, that should happen, because there's obviously a link between the two things. So I'll tick that box, press that button, that will be the outcome. And life doesn't really work that way. Relationships are very messy and complex and nuanced. So if they do make that transition, they have to sort of begin to understand a little bit more about human psychology and behavior and emotion and people. And that's where I think your world is so fascinating. I've always been a huge fan of the movies. I think that film or any form of drama is a wonderful way of understanding the human condition and those deeper drivers of behavior and relationship building. So I think that you and I definitely are on the same page with that, but people who've come from a different background of a technical profession, they've almost got to unlearn what they what they were judged by initially, and then learn a whole new suite of skills.
Yeah. And again, that goes back to, acting exercises where you kind of have to shed yourself, almost shed everything that you've learned in order to be able to take on another character.
Yes.
And so, yeah, it is difficult. It's not easy because and it probably goes back to Ken Robinson again, is that when we get to that sort of secondary education, we forget how to play. We go through secondary school having to tick all those boxes, pass those exams. By the time we come out the other end, we are so worried about doing what we think we should do that we kind of block ourselves from actually doing all of these things. And so it's very difficult when you get into specifically the corporate world. And I have to admit, I don't really know much. I've never worked in a corporate environment. So I'm kind of a little bit alien to that. But it seems to me that, there's a uniform, there's a language, there's all of these things that people think they should do. And they should be like that. Actually, people forget how to be playful, how to actually enjoy their work, and how to enjoy relationships with people around them.
I think one of the blockages, Jackie, is that they will value what they see as having utility. If it's will expedite some process, if it will get me a better promotion, if it will lead to a better salary, being viewed, as my status or whatever, if it has utility, then they will suddenly focus on that particular soft skills training. And it's a shame in a way. And it does remind me, I was on a walk yesterday listening to Radio 4. It was the Digital Human series. It's 4:30 on Radio 4 in the week. And they were talking about this controversy at the moment. Well, it's been around for a while, of students buying essays that are pre-done, or getting other people to do, the studies for them, so that they actually get the certificate, they get the qualification. So the utility for them is, I've got to get that qualification to get the job, to get the promotion, and so forth. And they're not really interested in the process of self-development and learning stuff.
Yeah.
That doesn't really, that's not the driver. The driver is to get the certificate, is to get the qualification. So even though we're not necessarily talking in business about an educational qualification, this idea of does it have utility, I think is a blockage for people seeing value in some of the stuff that you and I do.
Yeah.
The story I'll read for you.
There once were 3 little girls.
This is a dream that I think really shows how we view transformation.
Dreams, emotions, empathy, connection, stories, storytelling with Puck. Find your next tantalizing tale on your favorite podcast platform or at puckcreations.com/storytelling with Puck podcast.
Have you found, though, do you think that lockdown has made people think differently in that way? That maybe people working from home, people valuing relationships more, valuing work colleagues, and that whole kind of going to the office and being part of a community. Do you think that's changed people's attitudes to what we do?
I think it's, in some ways, it's humanized a lot of otherwise rather cold transactional relationships, because we actually see into people's homes. We see we hear the Amazon delivery person arrive. We hear a daughter coming home from university, a cat walking along the screen, whatever it happens to be. So we can see that this is a real human being, trying to do their best in a home working situation. So I think that's been helpful.
Yeah.
I think that we have cut out a lot of travel time, and some would consider it lost time, to be able to have more conversations on a screen. So I think more conversations is good, but loss of in-between time, I think, is also problematic, because the in-between time is not without value, because you have time to decompress, to reflect on what you've just been talking about with somebody, to move from one environment and reset mentally for the next environment that you're going to be in. And then for me, there's all those incidental interactions with people that you're sitting next to on a bus or a train or a plane that creates material and richness in life.
Yeah.
So it's been a mixed bag for me, and I think for others as well. They recognize the shortcomings in the digital home working arrangement.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you been part of any of this sort of hybrid presenting now? I mean, I hadn't even really considered the lack of content by just not leaving our house. Actually, is a big one, isn't it? Really, that you're not having those interactions.
Well, I think you're narrowing your range of experiences. I think you're having lots of varied conversations with people of varied backgrounds, so that there's the variety, but it's limited because it's all on a screen in our living room or wherever.
Yeah,
and therefore that's a less rich tapestry of experience than we used to have.
Yes, I have been part of a networking community down here on the South Coast that I used to go to in person before, obviously, the pandemic. Once lockdown hit, it kind of went online, and it was a bit of a lifeline, to be honest, just to see people on a screen I think it was every week in the beginning, whereas we only used to meet once a month. And since we've been allowed out, I think it was the beginning of July, Mark Masters, who organises the events, got back into a theatre space and worked out how to put the Zoom community on a screen, but still have us locals attend in person.
Yes.
And obviously the first one was a little bit glitchy, but we were all part of that community. We were just glad to be out of the house and doing something different. But the presenter, there was a guy doing a talk then, and I was just fascinated to how he was dealing with the fact that he had this huge wall of faces behind him on a cinema screen, and yet he also had us as an audience to perform to. And he did find it very difficult. It's been tweaked so that, because it's like, who do you speak to? Who's most important? Is it the people on the screen that are attending from home, or is it the people that are in?
I've not done this. So I know exactly what you're talking about, and I would find it difficult to split focus. Who am I being attentive to? Who am I focusing on? The physical presence or the people on the screen. Because I typically would get involved with the people who are there because I can sense their presence. And then I might suddenly realize, oh my God, I've forgotten all about this. There's 100 people on the screen. I better talk to them for a minute. So I would find that quite tricky. Yes.
I spoke to the speaker again this week. We had another meeting, John Burkhart, who was doing a talk for us again. And he said, right, well, this time I'm just going to concentrate on the people in the auditorium and let the people with the tech not pander, but deal with the people on the screen. So in other words, they were there with the cameras. So as long as they caught everything he was doing, then it works that way. But
they're almost like the voyeurs there, as opposed to the people, the actual audience with whom you're having the interaction.
Yeah. So it meant that he just had that one focus. But it will, this innovation that's come out of the pandemic is going to live with us forever. We can't now put that back in the box.
Yes.
And certainly, and I don't know how it's been for you, and we'll come on to the group that you've been working with. But I said to Mark, has he made a rod for his own back? Because in lockdown, on the Zoom call, it went global. So, there were speakers from the States, people coming in from the States. And you can't kind of cut those off when you go back into a room. You can't say, well, sorry, you can't come anymore because you're not able to get to us.
Yeah.
So somehow you've got to include those people too. And that's how the hybrid event has kind of that's happened.
But you mentioned before, I mentioned before that I was speaking the first physical gig I'm doing next week in the northeast of England. And one of the things that struck me there is that I've now got to unlearn some of the things that I've got used to doing in the last 18 months of maybe asking people a question and getting them to type an answer in the chat function, let's say on Zoom. And now if I ask the whole live audience a question, then, they've all got to think, well, hang on a minute, if I put my hand up and say something, all these other people might think I'm stupid. So I'll just keep my hand down.
Yeah.
You've almost got to switch back to what you used to do and relearn,
Yes.
how to, adapt to a live audience now.
Yes. Yeah. And yes, everybody's gotten so used as well. So many people now are doing the live videos where they go out on Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever, and they can interact like
Yes.
that. And as you say, it's quite, I know certainly from online networks that I've been to, the conversations will go on in the chat that have nothing to do with what's going on on the screen.
Yeah.
And actually it's quite anonymous. I also find breakout rooms to be quite intimate, which, at these sort of bigger conferences and networking, there's so many distractions. Whereas on Zoom in a breakout room, you can get to know somebody quite well.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit more about, is it in crowd?
The in crowd, yes.
Crowd, yes. So it's a new initiative that you
it's
set up.
It's an idea that Paula Eddy and I came up with. Paula is a friend of mine. She's a leadership coach who moved from the corporate world for many, many years in the corporate world to set up on her own as a leadership coach. And in stands for influence. So it's really an exploration of how you and I and others build up a voice and an influence in our sector, whereby people want to hear what we have to say, and how you go about doing that, or how have you gone about doing that. So this is an example, podcasting. There's lots of other P's in our list of strategies, like public speaking, publications. Paula talks a lot about purpose as well, being a very important part of building that name and that brand. So really the idea is to bring together people who are at various stages of developing their name and their influence. Some are starting out, some are well down the line. So the ones who are well down the line can teach the ones who are starting out quite a few tricks about how they've done it. And equally, the ones who are beginning can feed off them and squeeze some nuggets out of those people. And Paula and I are there to host and to facilitate that discussion. So the idea is that every time we hold an event, and at the moment these are all virtual events, we will focus on one particular theme of a list of, say, 10, types of strategies, and then generate some discussion around that theme. But then the conversation will spread around other areas of, well, I've done this, I've tried this, I'm struggling with that a little bit. So it's a self-help discussion-based group around the building of influence.
Excellent. Talking of podcasts, obviously you have a podcast too. How do you, and I know because we've sort of met by putting adverts of each other's podcasts into our own, which has been great and fun to do. But we are all in the business of persuasion. I know that from the advert that I hear every at least once a month, if not fortnightly. So tell us a little bit about the podcast and how that sort of, we're all in the business of persuade, or we're all in the persuasion business. How does that come up?
Well, the name of the podcast, I actually well, I didn't pinch it, but I heard someone use this phrase, and he's in a not dissimilar field to you and I. He's in, communication skills training. And he used this phrase that, he wants people to say things that are interesting so people lean forward. And I thought, oh, that's a good name for a podcast. so it's inspired by what that gentleman said. So it's called Leaning Forward. And it's really about the art of persuasive communication, relationship building, soft influencing skills. And it's a mixture of interviews. And I interviewed you recently, and I'm actually editing your interview today.
Brilliant. Which
doesn't mean cutting lots of stuff out, because I don't think I actually need to cut much stuff out. But yours is up quite soon for publication. I've done about 24 episodes, 25 so far. So it's a mixture of interviews with interesting people such as yourself who are involved in some kind of communication field, and little tutorial episodes. So the ones that are tutorials, I just record a shorter one. It may be 12, 15 minutes or so, about things like using humor, why stories work in an anecdotal sense, how to sell without it feeling like selling. So these are areas which I am passionate about. I love talking about them, but it's nice, to get other people to give their input through the interview format too.
Yeah. And so is this something that you ever envisaged yourself doing when you were little? What did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, Jackie, it's funny because I always trace my interest in public speaking and storytelling to Parkinson.
Ah.
So Michael Parkinson, for the younger viewers, was the Graham Norton of his day. He was a great interviewer, a different style of interviewing. But I used to watch his show on a Saturday evening. I think it was after Match of the Day on a Saturday night. And I wanted to be the guest, the Peter Ustinov or the whoever, who was a great raconteur, a great storyteller. Billy Connolly, he was very funny and one of Michael Parkinson's favorite guests. I wanted to be that person. But over the years, I've actually come to value Parkinson's skill as an interviewer. So in a way, I really like podcast interviews now, whether I'm being a guest as I am with you or whether I'm on the other side of the coin, because I think it feeds in with my interest in questioning, getting the story out of the other person. And I think the art of being an interviewer is very underrated. And if you look at someone like Graham Norton, he actually makes the guests look better because he will quip and pick up on something and add a little bit to something that they've said that was marginally funny. And he makes it funnier without somehow taking away, the gloss or the luster of the guest.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I absolutely have come from the same background, I suppose, in that way. Yeah, I used to love Michael Parkinson. I mean, that was just a highlight. Even now, I will go and find interviews because I loved his style. It was very, as you say, he was just interested. That sort of curiosity he had in what made people tick and why they were who they were. And again, Graham Norton is completely different, but it is about making the guest look as good as they possibly can.
Yeah,
So,
getting the best out of the guest. And you look at someone like Robert De Niro, can't really be bothered anymore. He just sort of sits there and smiles and does his Bob De Niro thing. But there are other guests who are dream-like guests. I mean, Emily Blunt's always good. She's very, very good on the show, and obviously Tom Hanks is always a winner.
Yes.
So I'm fascinated by the interview format and shows. I watch interviews endlessly. But you pick up a lot of really good tips, I think, from both sides, from the guest and from the interviewer.
Yeah, yeah. That just it made me think of you talking about Sir Robin and those kind of celebrity talks, which you get on cruise ships, and the celebrities do these sort of turns on cruise ships, basically because they get a free cruise. And I do wonder how. Well, I suppose it really is just telling stories, isn't it? It's just being a raconteur. As you say, that the Peter Ustinovs, the Billy Connollys are these people that know how to tell a story. Yeah,
they do. And the episode that I did in Leaning Forward on humor, I mean, there's always this phrase that it's a very bad idea to try and analyze comedy or humor, but it strikes me that one of the things that is always funny is where there is a contrast between the way things should be and the way they are. That there's always comedy in that. So the person should react in that way. They should be wearing these sorts of clothes. They should have this kind of expression on their face when this was said to them, but they mishear it and they think it was something else. And therein lies the humor. Yeah. And I think wherever you can find a difference, a contrast like that, there is always the potential to make people smile when you're recounting that scene.
Yes. Yeah, and it is that, and again, this comes back to acting, and when I'm going through training with actors, is just tell the truth, just be honest, and you would be amazed how much humor there is just in the everyday. You don't have to try to be funny. Just tell that story the way it happened. If it made you laugh, and there's enough, it's interesting enough for you to want to retell it, then just tell it as it is. Don't it doesn't need bells and whistles and all that.
It doesn't, and it's little everyday things. I heard a speaker the other day refer to the fact that his grandmother had discovered texting, and she would regularly use the expression WTF in her texts. And he said, "Well, you can't say that, Grandma. You mustn't say things like that." She said, "Why?" It just means, well, that's fantastic. Because she was proud of her grandson. So that you're absolutely right. It is an exploration of the basic truth of life and the human condition, where the nuggets lie, where all the the richness is.
Yes. Well, before we end here, I'd like you to tell us a funny story. So tell us about when you appeared on a TV quiz back in the 80s. What was that, and how
Well,
did that?
I'll have to give you the slightly shorter version of this. I used to work for the Professional Golfers Association. They're based at the Belfry in the Midlands, and I was a referee. And I was very fortunate to referee in the Ryder Cup one year. And there was a show in the old days called Busman's Holiday. I don't know whether you remember it. It was where 3 people represented a profession and competed against 2 other teams of 3 in their profession. So you had to answer questions on the other profession and on your own, and then a bit of general knowledge as well. So we were referees, and our specialist subject was the rules of golf, because that's what we were meant to know. And we were up against a team of herbalists and a team of debt collectors from British Gas. And this was all filmed at Granada Studios in Manchester. And you were meant to bring an object to the show on the stage when you came along that was connected with your work. So I think the debt collectors brought a nasty letter. I think the herbalists brought maybe a sprig of parsley or something, I don't know. And we brought on the Ryder Cup. So we puffed out our chests. We were all university graduates. We thought we were smart people, and we thought, well, we're ahead already, bringing our prop on. And it was an absolute unmitigated disaster, Jackie, because we got the lowest score I think ever recorded in quiz show history, because we just blurted out the wrong answer. We were too quick. We didn't do our research on the other teams. We were the very definition of complacency. And all I can remember beforehand is that the person guiding us just said, look, if you don't know the answer, don't worry, just smile, just look happy. So I had this inane grin on my face all the way through, despite the fact that I was really bombing. And it turned out that the questions were compiled by a great rival of ours in terms of golfing organizations. So they created the stinkiest questions imaginable to trip us up. And boy, did we trip up. And the next day, the other 2 on my team had to go back to the office and face the music. And I actually had to fly to America to run a tournament in the US. I don't know which was worst, having an 8-hour journey to think about what had just happened, or go back to the office.
Oh, so what's the lesson in there? Be prepared.
Be prepared. Don't be complacent, and be very, very wary of going on a quiz show when you're answering questions about your own profession.
Yes. Yeah. And how did you manage to upset a TV dragon?
No, it wasn't an upset. It was a misunderstanding. When my then business partner and I started our business, it's called Mojo Life, as in finding your mojo. That's what we originally had the idea for. I mean, it's evolved a lot since then. It's just my company name is still called that, but the work doesn't represent that angle anymore. But Peter Jones came into an exhibition at Olympia that we were exhibiting at. And obviously we wanted to sort of pitch our new business idea to Peter Jones. You would do, wouldn't you, if you were excited about it? And my business partner explained, her version of the story, her little elevator pitch. And he turned to me and he said, so your business shrinks. And I must have given a look on my face of horror, because dragons are known for spotting the flaw in a business idea that you don't see. And I thought, oh my God, he's thought of something that the business is going to get smaller. It's going to be a disaster. I thought we were going to grow. And he said, no. I mean, you're business psychologists. Did you know I was going to say that, Jackie? So Y-O-U apostrophe R-E.
Yes, I got it. But I think that's, sometimes that's the way your brain works. If you think somebody's going to say something detrimental, that's what you hear. So
maybe I was afraid that he would find that flaw in the concept and would say it's going to be a disaster. You pack it in now, Andrew, kind of thing. Anyway, we got on very well after that misunderstanding was cleared up.
Excellent. Did he invest?
No. He said, "I'm out."
I'm out, and he left the room. So what's coming up for you, apart from obviously talking in person to a real audience? What's happening for you and the podcast and the in crowd?
Okay, well, In Crowd comes next on the 16th of November. It's 5:30 till 7 in the evening UK time. So I'll promote that, and so will Paula via social media and LinkedIn. I've got my Durham gig with a live flesh and blood audience next Thursday, which I'm looking forward to. And then there is a chance, I think I might be going to Sweden and Finland in November with a client that I've done some work for before. So they're just mulling over whether or not it's going to be, online or face to face. So I actually haven't traveled anywhere since March last year with work. So that's going to be different. Excellent.
Well, I've got some where can people, let me show you, I've got at the bottom here, this is the podcast. I've also, if I can find it, for those of you that are watching, you can see this. For those of you on audio, you will have to tune into the YouTube channel to see this. But this is the podcast. So Leaning Forward. So that's the place to go if you'd like to listen to Andrew's podcast. It's Leaning Forward, and that's on most of the platforms, isn't it?
It is. I mean, if you just type it into Spotify or Apple Podcasts, it will come up. And if you type it into Google with my name next to it, it will come up as well. But I'd love people to listen to it and give me some feedback.
Excellent. And where else can people contact you?
Well, I'm a regular user of LinkedIn, so they can find me on LinkedIn. I don't have an E on my surname. I've been cursed for 50 odd years now with no E on Thorp. And most Thorp do have an E. But I don't. So that's my LinkedIn profile.
Excellent. And the website?
It's just Andrew Thorp, andrewthorpe.co.uk.
There you go. I don't know if people can see that. I put the website on my board here. So andrewthorpe.co.uk. Oh, well, it's been fantastic talking to you, Andrew. I mean, it's so nice to talk to somebody that does what I do, and probably better than me. So
no, not at all. We cross over. I think we complement each other very, very well, Jackie. I really love the work you do, and I'm so fascinated by the world of acting that you are steeped in. So I'm quite envious of all your experience that you've got.
Oh, well, thank you. I wish I could say the same about golf. But yes. So your brother is a golfer, isn't he? You were saying.
Yeah, well, he's retired now. Dave is 10 years older than me, so he's retired. But he was my hero when I grew up. Because I caddied for him in lots of very big tournaments, like the Open Golf Championship 4 times. I think we played it, and it's we. When you're a caddy and a player, it's always a we relationship.
Brilliant. And do you still play golf now?
Occasionally, yeah. My current passion's table tennis.
Oh.
Because my partner has a table tennis table in her barn, and my eyes lit up when I first saw it. So we play a lot of table tennis now.
Brilliant. Oh, well, I will let you go off and play table tennis to your heart's content. But thank you so much for being on my podcast, Andrew. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Jackie. Likewise. All the best to you.
You're welcome.